everyone, and welcome to our second edition of the Archaeological Science Interview Series, sponsored by the Society for Archaeological Sciences, also known as SAS. My name is Jayde Hirniak, and I am a graduate student at Arizona State University studying archaeology and geology, and I'm also an SAS student ambassador. Similar to our previous interview with Dr. Speller, we will be continuing the trend of interviewing SAS members and getting to know our executive board a little bit more. And today I will be hosting our interview with Dr. Andrew Zipkin, who is the SAS Vice President for Intersociety Relations. Dr. Zipkin is also an adjunct professor with the School of Human Evolution and Social Change at Arizona State University, and he's currently working as an industrial analytical chemist and materials scientist with the Eurofins EAG Laboratories in Syracuse, New York. So before I go any further, thank you, Dr. Zipkin, for being here today.
Thank you, Jade. It's great to see you.
Yeah, it's great to see you as well. And because this is a sponsored SAS talk, I'd like to start today's discussion with learning a little bit more about your involvement with SAS. And funny enough, you're actually the reason why I became involved with the society back when I was a first-year graduate student. And it really has been, it's expanded my research network, and it's been an important shift in my career. But the funny thing is, I actually have no idea how you became involved in SAS. So if you can expand on your current position right now and enlighten me why you joined SAS, that would be a great start.
Sure, I'd be happy to. And actually, I'm really glad that you brought that up. One of the reasons why I recruited you and other members when I first got to ASU in 2018 is that I really do feel sort of an obligation to pay it forward, because when I was a graduate student at George Washington University in 2011, I believe, I submitted a poster to an SAS poster prize competition at the Society for American Archaeology annual meeting, and I won. And the then General Secretary, Rob Sternberg, who is still a member of our board and really sort of one of the most valuable members of our board, in my opinion, because he's sort of our institutional knowledge. He's been in almost every role the society has to offer over the course of his career. But he came to me at the conference and he presented me with the prize and welcomed me to SAS, and that was how it started. He said, "Good job with the poster, happy to have you on board. Here's a free membership for the next year or so." So I wasn't very active for the first couple of years. I guess 3 years or so, I was a member, and then I finished my PhD in 2015 and went to the University of Illinois in 2016, at which time the newly elected SAS president, Dr. Rachel Popelka-Tholkoff, who is one of already my close collaborators, because we both work on the archaeometry of ochre, she emailed me out of the blue from Australia. At the time, we were not working together yet, and said, "Andrew, you've been a member for a while. We work on similar stuff. I like your work. Do you want to join the board as the vice president of social media?" Mm-hmm. So for about three and a half years, I was SAS's social media guy and built up our Facebook, LinkedIn, other channels pretty much from scratch. And that was a lot of work, but it was also a lot of fun, because I just had pretty much complete latitude to do whatever I wanted, so long as it turned out okay in the end. So that's how I got involved in the board. After 3.5 years of that, I was a bit tired of the social media role, so I had time to move on and let someone else take over that position, which is what Ben Marwick is now doing in that role. And since then, I've been focused more through intersociety relations on creating new partnerships with other external organizations that share goals and potentially overlapping audiences with SAS.
Wow. Yeah, no, that is, I didn't realize that your career, I guess your involvement with SAS started with that poster award, which we still do have, which is great and really great to know as well. But thank you for that. That's awesome. And next, I would like to dive more into your specific research area and learn more about your personal journey in academia. So I know you have a background in and are currently working with various materials, including ochre, silkrete, and ostrich egg shells, which I think each of those materials we can do like a whole separate interview series. But for the purposes of this discussion, I'd like to expand on your work with ochre, since that's what you've been working on the longest, I believe. So, and I know much of your research, including your dissertation, involves sourcing ochre. To begin, can you just define what ochre is? I know even people working in the field sometimes need a reminder of what exactly ochre is. And would you be able to explain how you initially got involved in this line of work? Did you always know as an undergraduate that you'd be working with this type of material?
Oh, only it were so. My road to being an archaeological scientist is a bit more complicated than that. I was a biological sciences pre-med major, an undergraduate, and absolutely hated it. I ended up in archaeology because I loved science, but despised being a pre-med biologist. So I ended up at Cornell University as what was then called a biology and society major. So it was a lot of biological sciences coursework, but also history of science, philosophy of science, and then other things you could sort of add in from the humanities and social sciences. And I really leaned into the archaeology side of that as an undergraduate. So I went from sort of a biological science background to grad school for human paleobiology or paleoanthropology. So I actually have a pretty anatomy and biology heavy background, even though I spent most of my PhD and then subsequent time working on rocks and minerals, essentially. But with regard to working on ochre, what happened was I interviewed at George Washington University with Alison Brooks in the spring of 2009, when I was a senior and undergraduate, to go to grad school there with her. And I told her I was interested in working on the origins of human use of material symbolism, the storage of information outside of the body through physical material symbols like self-adornment with paint or cave art, jewelry, things like that. And we had this great talk about potential for studying some of the oldest ochre in East Africa at her site in Lagos Island, Kenya, and really just hit it off. So I ended up going to GW as Alison Brooks' graduate student, where I pretty much leaned into working on ochre right away within the first year or so. You know, I went in with a little bit of, do I really want to go sort of the geo-arc route, or do I really want to stay a bit more toward bioanth? And after a few months, I was pretty clear that I wanted to go sort of the archaeology, particularly archaeological sciences route. So within a couple of years of being there, I'm getting ready to defend my dissertation proposal. And I'm, you know, in the year before that, I sort of realized that the questions I'm starting to ask about how do we tell when ochre in the archaeological record is symbolic versus just sort of coincidentally present or opportunistically acquired. A lot of these questions are ultimately going to require me to try to figure out where this stuff comes from relative to where it ended up in an archaeological site. The idea being that people go out of their way to exploit mineral resources from specific sources on the landscape, as opposed to just opportunistically acquiring it. That's really an important indicator of intent, that you really are not doing this in a sort of opportunistic way, but you're doing it quite deliberately, and it involves forethought, right? So at this point, this is about 2010 or so, it's pretty clear that trying to source ochre is sort of a growing area in the archaeological sciences. It's difficult, it does not work sometimes, but people have gotten it into their head that it's viable, mostly because of Rachel Felkoff, who I already mentioned, because she did her PhD at the University of Missouri about that earlier in the 2000s and demonstrated that it is actually possible. So right around this time, there are a bunch of people my age, my point in the career, who all have the idea we should try to figure out how to use geochemistry and material science to do prevenient studies of iron oxide pigments. And to get back to sort of your question, what is ochre? Rachel and I literally published a paper about this about a month and a half ago, because it's so amorphously defined that we sort of felt the need to just go out there and say, look, can we all just agree to use this very broad umbrella term, and then within the term ochre to actually say what minerals you're talking about, so we all have some idea what's going on. But that umbrella term, ochre, or ochre sensu lato, as we have been referring to it, it's pretty much any sort of geological or even biological material that derives its color from an iron mineral chromophore. So a molecule in which iron is present and gives the predominant color to that material. That's pretty much it. It has to be a naturally occurring material, not synthetic, and derive its color from iron. And under that umbrella category, you can get into all different sorts of geological subdivisions.
And so you mentioned just now, so for some of our audience that might not know, would you be able to go over specifically how and why we source the ochre, and why sourcing this material helps us reconstruct the past and modern human behavior? You did mention a little bit about symbolism and exploiting different resources, but if you go into that in detail, that'd be great.
Sure. So one of the most sort of intractable problems in Paleolithic archaeology, especially people who are interested in the origin of material symbolism, is, as I mentioned, distinguishing functional versus purely symbolic uses of ochres and mineral pigments, because this material, which is very diverse, occurs in some form or other pretty much all over the world, can be used in both capacities. Iron oxides can be added to plant resins to improve the durability of haptic adhesives made for use making compound tools. You could put it on your body to protect you from sun, wind, exposure, bug bites. But at the same time, it can also be simultaneously symbolic, because it's not just protecting your body. There can be designs on there, be on certain parts of your body, different types of ochre in different parts of your body. there's certainly other uses as well. I mean, it's been speculated that ochre was consumed as sort of a dietary supplement in some cases. I don't think evidence for that's great, but it keeps sort of reoccurring in the literature, this idea. But it's used in all these capacities aside from being used as a pigment, right? And that's where it gets really tricky. So one of the main things that we're stuck with in really the prehistoric record is just trying to figure out if you have multiple types of ochre in the same archaeological site. So different minerals like hematite, ferrite, ferrohydrite, ferruginous sandstones, specular hematite. These are all ochres. They're all iron oxide rocks and minerals. Why is there this diversity present potentially? Or if there is not very much diversity, is it only just one type of ochre? Is that because only one type occurs nearby? Or if there's lots of different red things on the landscape, are people going to a single specific source to acquire something they bring back to the site, right? The reason why that's important is if people are very systematically exploiting mineral resources, that has a lot to say then about their cognition, their ability to plan, and their rationale for why they exert energy exploiting a particular source rather than opportunistically acquiring whatever sort of convenient red or yellow stuff is found nearby, right? So we're talking about a time period where, at least for me, I was working in sort of the early Middle Stone Age when I was a graduate student. There isn't rock art. There isn't actual art. There's just evidence of the little bits, the remains of these lumps of pigment left behind. So people were probably decorating their bodies or other sort of ephemeral substrates that are not well preserved at this point. What we have left are essentially broken crayons. That's what we've got behind. So we're stuck with the trash, not the art.
That's great. I think that also should maybe be another definition. I don't know if you mentioned this in your paper, but ochre is pretty much broken crayons.
Not always. It occurs in a lot of different forms, but that's sort of one of the classic examples where you get these small, very heavily abraded pieces that have been ground on surfaces to make powder or actually used potentially like a crayon or sidewalk chalk. But you'll often find those archaeological sites because those are cohesive pieces that remain. My position on this is that most of the ochre ever acquired and used by human beings has probably been lost to the archaeological record because it's not cohesive. It's a powder or a residue or a paint. So once you take that rock and subtractively grind it down to powder, there's no longer any cohesive artifact left for the majority of the ochre that was collected. All we see that's left behind are the little bits that were remnants that were not ground down in most cases. Sometimes you do see stains or residues that actually darken the sediment of an archaeological site. So you might have had an ochre-based liquid or paint or just processing residue in the form of dust that has really heavily stained the site. But most of the time, you get those little cohesive nuggets and that's it.
So I actually did not realize the different forms of ochre until I started talking to you today. When you're analyzing that and trying to source it from a specific archaeological site, do you look for certain types of ochre that are ideal to get those fingerprints?
Ochre is one of the more difficult materials to do provenience studies on. So let's talk about something that's really a great example. Obsidian is one of the best known materials for geochemical provenience studies. And the reason for that is that obsidian is volcanic glass. It comes from a well-defined point source. It comes from a particular volcano and a particular lava flow on that volcano. Because of the way these things work, you have a magma chamber that has a unique geochemical fingerprint to it. Everything derived from that volcano shares to some extent that fingerprint and can be separated out from other magma chambers that lead to eruptions elsewhere, right? Jade, you do this sort of work, so I'm completely off base. Cut in, please.
No, you're doing great.
So obsidian is a great material to source. It's actually one of the earliest materials, aside from pottery, that archaeometrists tried to do provenience studies on using neutron activation analysis, which was invented after World War II. So that's kind of an ideal example of something you can source. Ochre is at the other end of the spectrum. It's basically a nightmare most of the time. As opposed to being a homogeneous volcanic glass, one, iron is every place. It is all over the surface of the earth in many different forms. Some of these are nice little point sources, kind of like obsidian. You can get small hills made of specular hematite. I worked in Zambia at one point, and there was a place called Sanji Hill, south of Lusaka, that was the probable source of the specular hematite ochre found at a nearby Middle Stone Age archaeological site. And this was literally a hill composed of boulders of iron oxide and nothing else, basically. That's a point source. That's geographically defined, spatially delineated. That's pretty easy. But what about if you have a several hundred kilometer long rock formation of, say, ferruginous sandstone, such as you get in South Africa, or siltstone? Some of the very famous shales in the South African, in the Western Cape and Eastern Cape along the coast that were used as ochres are just continuous deposits that go for tens to hundreds of kilometers. Is that entire formation a source? Or is each individual outcrop of that formation that's been exposed by weathering action or convectivity, are those sources? So that's where this gets really complex. And actually, one of the things that we're going to potentially be working on next, Rachel and I, possibly some other collaborators, is figuring out how do you define what a source is for archaeological convenience studies for materials that aren't so well delineated. It's not like necessarily a very clearly defined ore body. So if you're looking at, it's not a silver mine, for example, right? Or it's not a lava flow. It's just a continuously available resource across the landscape in some cases. Because what you call a source is a huge deal, because those are your units of analysis, right? Most of what we do is measure the element composition of these materials and then use multivariate stats to tell them apart. Try to use various techniques to statistically differentiate among source A, B, and C using their chemical composition. But how you define source A, if source A actually is sources A1, A2, and A3, they have subsources that are chemically distinct, that makes a huge difference. The math either works or it doesn't based upon these categorical definitions. So a major unresolved area in this sort of line of work is how do we adequately and usefully define a source such that our unit of analysis makes sense for our objectives.
So that actually leads into my next question really nicely, because I do know a lot of your work involves, going over these challenges and how sourcing ochre is not a very straightforward process. I know how much time and effort you've put into trying to solve those obstacles. Do you have, besides understanding these complexities, do you have any advice for maybe early career scientists who want to conduct similar research and maybe collect samples for analysis? Is there anything that you would recommend to them given the complexity and challenges of this line of research?
Sure. So as someone who went into this around 2011 with a bunch of good ideas and absolutely no earthly idea how to actually enact them, don't be intimidated by the sense that you have no idea what you're doing. You don't. It'll get better, but you need to go out there and just try. So what do I mean? 2011, I was doing my first survey of ochre sources that I actually executed and designed myself rather than as part of a team while part of a project in Malawi. And I realized that previously, having worked in Kenya, what was being referred to as ochre in Malawi was quite a bit different. These were not ochres derived from the weathering of volcanic rocks like we get in the Kenya Rift. These are sedimentary ochres. They are poorly lithified sandstones and siltstones. They're clay deposits. They're these sort of kind of nasty, amorphously defined, really very clear spatial boundaries to them types of ochre. And I had no idea where to begin. But one of the sort of breakthrough moments for me was when I was sort of walking down a road in northern Malawi with this geological map in hand, looking for this mineral deposit that was marked on there, this sort of 60-year-old map. I went into this village and asked one of the local school teachers there if he knew anything about this. And he sort of just kind of smiled at me and said, just follow me. And in the middle of the village, there is probably about a 10-meter wide hole in the ground. That's not what was on the map, but it is a local ochre source that is dug out by residents. They use it to decorate their houses, and pregnant women engage in geophagy. They eat some of this clay, iron-rich ochre. So it's sort of a local practice, which has been documented in various forms all over the world, not always involving ochre, but often involving clays. So don't just rely on the literature resources or other scientists. Even if you're not a cultural anthropologist, if you're really on sort of the hard science side of archaeology, the way I am, you can absolutely not afford to ignore the cultural context. It's not to say that people who are living someplace right now should be treated as a blanket analogy for the ancient residents, but they live there. They know the environment a heck of a lot better than you do as an interloper. So make sure you take into account all the context that you can, all the information that you can. Even if it proves irrelevant later on, you need to have that sort of knowledge, that sort of area studies information to figure out what you know and what you don't know, right? You might have if you're limited by a geological map or remote sensing data, and you fail to actually ask somebody who is on the ground and who lives there and knows their own home, what may or may not be relevant to what you're trying to do, you're missing out, and you're going to come to potentially quite biased conclusions.
Yeah, I think that's really great advice, because I think that's really important just in archaeological research in general, really trying to build that extra context and getting more involved with the cultural like the culture of the local area, I think is key. So thank you for that. And now, so shifting gears, I would like to get in for the last part of our interview, I'd like to get into your career trajectory and where you are working today. I think talking to someone in your position is great for early career scientists, as I mentioned, because you are successful and are you at this point that many of us aspire to reach following our PhDs. And so, as I mentioned before, you recently got a job at Eurofins EAG Laboratories. Congrats about that.
Thank you.
Which I think, you know, for some of us after graduate school, that is a company that is one of our main objectives to get a job at. For students interested in following a similar career path, what are things that companies like Eurofins are looking for in terms of experience? And do you have any advice on the current archaeological students who might be going down a similar path?
Sure. So I'm actually really happy you asked about how I ended up working in industry and actually outside of archaeology, even not even for a CRM firm. I think to an extent, and this is something that's important to people who are in the archaeological sciences to be well aware of, that I specialized myself out of an academic career in many ways. By the time I was a postdoc in 2015, 2016, I started to get a sense that I cared more about the chemistry and the geochemistry more than about the big picture archaeological questions. And that, for me, was actually kind of gratifying. Like, okay, I actually know what I'm really excited about now. It may not be the thing I got a PhD in, though, exactly. So that was part of it. So if you're getting a degree in archaeology and you expect to get a job as an archaeologist, especially in the US, where there are not separate dedicated archaeological science programs generally at universities, always remember that you are an archaeologist first. If you want to be an archaeological chemist, your backup plan is to go be a chemist, not an archaeologist probably, because those skill sets become so specialized at some point, you're looking at a university job or even a cultural resource management job. The person interviewing you is going to go, why do you know how to run an ICP-MS? We need someone who can do a survey competently and who can manage a field crew. And even if you did that at some point, that's not the main part of your resume. It's going to raise some very interesting questions. So by the time I was a postdoc at University of Illinois for 3 years, a postdoc for 2 years at Arizona State University, and then a staff scientist at ASU in my last year when I was actually working there in Arizona. By the time I was a couple of years into being at ASU, I sort of had it in my head that I wanted to leave academia, not because I disliked the work that I was doing. I loved the research. I had great colleagues, including you, Jayde. So it wasn't the actual research, it was the career trajectory and sort of perpetual uncertainty of contract work. I was ready to settle down and move on from that phase of my life. But it wasn't easy. Getting a job when you have that sort of background and degree and you want to go work in chemistry, material sciences, a lot of companies are not willing to take a chance on. I don't have chemistry coursework. I have a decade of experience and hands-on training, mostly with geochemists, but I have not had a chemistry course since I was an undergraduate. So many companies that I applied to work with sort of looked at my resume and said, that's very impressive, but where on earth is your chemistry degree? Like, well, I have a PhD and a postdoc and all this experience doing chemistry. I've published on computational data analysis and on machine learning and on ICP-MS. And like, well, you're either overskilled or underskilled, or just have a confusing mix of skills. What on earth are we going to do with you? No. So I have to say, really, Eurofins EAG was much more open to someone with my background and skill set, because they were actually just hiring someone to be sort of a general ICP-MS analyst, sort of a staff scientist running pretty routine jobs. And I applied for this position on a whim, thinking, maybe they have something in addition to that available to me. And they were very excited. They had no qualms about me having a background predominantly in archaeology and geochemistry. They saw that I've been doing laser ablation since 2011 and realized, hey, we just lost our only person who can do laser ablation ICP-MS. So not only does this guy know chemistry and geoscience quite well, he can do this specialized form of mass spec that we can't do right now because we lost our only person who knows how to do it. So that turned out quite well. And frankly, it's been great. I really enjoy the much shorter time horizons for projects, 2 weeks to a month to turn things around and come up with a workable answer that addresses the objectives of the client. It's definitely a very much sort of thinking on your feet, experimental design sort of job. So very routine job, you might just ask, hey, what's this thing made of? We're just looking for trace impurities in a metal or in a plastic to make sure that we're compliant with regulations and there's nothing in here that shouldn't be. And that's pretty basic work that is important, but does not require too much intellectual investment. You just need to do the job competently, make sure your quality control is good, and move on. The jobs that are much more interesting are the ones where someone comes to you and says, we have part X that we manufacture, and for some unknown reason, it has just stopped working. It's failing in whatever application it's being put to, and we don't know what to do with this. Help. Those are the fun jobs, because then essentially you have to design an experiment very quickly, figure out how do you identify what's similar and different between the pieces that work and the pieces that don't, right? And these may be things that you've never worked on before or you've heard of in your life. Given that most of what I've done in academia involved minerals, ostrich eggshell, rocks, soils, plants, very much natural materials. I now work on synthetic rare earth iron garnets. I work on high performance ceramics used in body armor and in engines, medical devices, exotic resins that I've never heard of before because someone developed them in a laboratory a few weeks ago and is checking to make sure that their product is clean and not contaminated by the process of making these things. Semiconductors. So things I have had absolutely zero experience to work on before. So it's a bit of a learning curve, but it's very exciting because you see how much of the skill set actually does transfer. After having worked on such a diverse array of things in archaeology, it's sort of second nature to adapt your skill set, do a quick literature review, find out who's done what previously, what worked, what didn't, and then just go out and try, see what works. So that's what I've been doing for the last 6 months. And so far, it's been really a pleasure to work on these materials and with colleagues who are excited to see this skill set that I bring with me actually be applied to make their lives easier sometimes. And they have some sort of god-awful sample type that they really, really do not want to digest for solution mass spectrometry. The knowledge that, hey, let's give it to Andrew, see if he can do this for laser solid state. It's both fun for me and makes their lives a little bit less stressful.
Yeah, so from what I get from that, it seems like to get a job in industry, say transitioning from an academic role or academic career trajectory, you really do need the coursework backing up your experience. And you were fortunate enough that your experience obviously was, priority in your position. But I actually did not realize that. And that's very useful because as much as we think as graduate students, sometimes your transcript doesn't matter. In industry, it really does. And that I think is an important point. And it seems like, as you mentioned, a lot of the stuff we're learning in graduate school, just being a scientist, you really can just apply it to industry. You just have to kind of use that different lens from.
Absolutely. It's sure, some of it translates directly, like the actual skill set of knowing how to operate a nanosecond excimer laser and knowing what its properties are, how to interact with materials. That is a direct set of expertise and knowledge that transfers because it's the same hardware. But I think the more important thing is how to think about designing an experiment and interpretation and categories. We're talking about how we define ochre sources before. If you're doing a job for an industrial client, they say we have parts that don't work and parts that do work. Well, what if among the parts that don't work, there are 3 different causes, right? You need to be able to figure out on your feet how to sort of use differential variables that say, okay, what can we split off from this amorphous group of things that don't work? Well, these are alike, these are alike, these are alike. Maybe these are failing because of an impurity. These are failing because of some sort of structural integrity problem. And these aren't actually failing for any reason at all. They're sort of just failing sort of at sort of the normal stochastic rate of things breaking down. There is no actual systematic error in those samples over there. If they're lumped together, there's a lot of noise because they're different. They don't actually belong in the same group. That's sort of a roundabout way of saying, thinking about how you partition your data and your sample sets is a huge part of successfully designing and executing experiments in any field. Before you do anything involving hands-on work or data analysis, just how do you conceive of what your categories and your units of analysis are? That's a hard skill set to acquire. You mostly get it by doing it. I mean, people in engineering schools, they learn how to design experiments in a very explicit way. I don't think we're necessarily taught with that level of sort of quantitative rigor how to design experiments for a certain application. A lot of it you get by doing it and figuring out what works and what doesn't. And that just comes from constantly thinking about how you design and execute experiments over the course of graduate school, something you don't acquire in undergrad at all, I think.
Well, this has been great, Dr. Zipkin. Thank you again for spending the time with us here today to discuss your journey as, in academia and as an archaeological scientist. For everyone else, please subscribe to the SAS YouTube page, and thank you all for watching.
Jayde, always a pleasure.